In this fourth segment, I want to ask you a question about books. I made a video about some books that I read that were impactful and was incredibly blown away by how well it did. So there's an interest there. So someone who is well read, someone who reads a lot of books, how many books do you think you read a year?
Oh, I don't know. It varies. I think probably last year it was close to 100.
Yeah, whew, that's a lot of books. So what are some of the ones that you feel like are must-reads for anybody that loves the Bible?
Yeah, must-reads is such a strong term. Let me just share some that have been of great impact on me over the last few years.
Okay, fair enough.
The first I'll say is one that I read recently. I actually made a little list because I knew you were going to ask me this. There's a book called Reading Scripture with the Church Fathers by Christopher Hall. And he goes through a process of dividing the Western and the Eastern Church Fathers as to how they went through their process of interpretation or hermeneutics. And it just really helped me to move past the I've only learned to do hermeneutics or interpretation one way because I live in the 20th and 21st century as an American.
Right.
But to be able to get a biblical historian's view of how the early church fathers interacted with the scripture was immeasurably helpful to me and gave me an even greater appreciation both for the legacy that we hold in the church, but how those earliest and closest to the scriptures being written, how they handled the scriptures.
There's actually a resurgence of people seeking out the early church fathers. I think that is an invaluable thing because while there were some weird things that happened in church history, we can't just throw out everything that the Bible has been built on, the history of the church has been built on.
Absolutely. And I think that it's important both for how we interact with the scriptures, but it's also important for how we interact with culture. Because the early church fathers were not living in a culture necessarily that was friendly to Christianity. And so there's a lot that we can learn missionally from the early church fathers. Another book that I would point out is one that is a modern book, and he recently passed away, is Presbyterian pastor from New York City, Tim Keller. Now, I'm not Presbyterian, I'm Baptist, and so...
Y'all heard that here, he admitted it.
So Tim and I would have disagreed on a few secondary issues. But his book, Preaching, is not a lengthy book, and though it is focused on the idea of preaching, it is one that I have used in training Sunday school teachers and helping people to understand how to just read and study the Bible for themselves. Tim had such a pastoral way about him, even though he was a brilliant thinker.
There's something about Tims.
Yeah, it is something about some Tims. And so I've actually recommended his book on preaching, which is really more of a book not on preaching as it is about learning how to study passages of Scripture, as one more way for people to dig in. Another book that I would point people's attention to is The Analyzed Bible by G. Campbell Morgan. And Morgan was the pastor of the Westminster Chapel in London, England. He was a big influence in terms of his writings on my life and his preaching style. But during the course of his decades-long ministry, he would go into the scripture and he would write a summary of every chapter of the Bible.
Wow.
And so the Analyzed Bible, there's an abridged format, and then there's like a 6-volume format where you just get like this little 400-word mini sermon on every chapter of the Bible. There's another edition that he did called Searchlights, where he took a key verse from every chapter of the Bible and wrote a 300-word summary of how to understand that verse in the context of the Bible. And I have found those to be really great resources when I've been reading the scripture and I needed a pastoral influence about how to understand this or what to do with this. I go to his. And then the last book I would encourage people to read, because of my own investment, both personally and vocationally, with the New King James Version, is the book authored by Arthur Farstad, In the Great Tradition. And it is about the process that he took the translation committee to actually come to the end, from beginning to end, of how did the New King James Version come to be. It is an unusual opportunity for us to get insight into the process of how does a Bible translation happen. And it's written for everyday people. It's not written from an academic standard where an everyday reader couldn't understand it.
I read it in 2 days.
Yeah. It's a fascinating read, and so I would encourage everybody to read that. I want you to use the New King James Version, and maybe reading that might win you over, but no matter what translation is your primary one, I think reading that book called In the Great Tradition would be helpful for you to understand and have an even deeper appreciation for how God has worked through these processes to bring us Bible translations.
And the thing about that book that I loved the most was, number one, it gives you a list of names of people that are involved in it, but the way they went through such great lengths to not necessarily replace the King James, but to honor the King James. And I thought that was a big deal. And he used the something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue kind of aspects to it. So you'll have to get the book. I'll put the links to all the books that he mentioned in this video description, just in case you want to pick them up. But that Arthur Farstad book was impactful. And for me, the most impactful books I've read, I'm kind of a weird guy. I like weird things. And Michael Heiser has a book called The Unseen Realm. And then he has a book called Angels and Demons. They kind of all work together and really gives you a look into the old worldview and their view of the supernatural world. And it's kind of an eat the meat, spit the bone. It's not a perfect book. He's got some odd views on the Nephilim and different things, but ultimately, I really enjoyed those books. Those are ones that are highly technical. They're very difficult to read, and they're really weird. So, if you like really weird stuff, especially involving the supernatural world, then that's a really good read. The reason I like it is because it kind of pulls me out of that Western mindset, because we try to naturalize so many things. And while he may be overly supernatural, at least it kind of pulls us into balance. That's the kind of stuff I like. You seem to like really theological and Bible breakdown stuff, and a lot of the books that you tell me about that you read are in that vein, and I like things that will shift my thinking, that will challenge, because as Pentecostals, we can go off the rails pretty fast. So I want something to kind of keep me on the guardrail at least.
Yeah. And I'll say, as somebody who has, for the better part of my life, have been a part of a Baptist church and in the Baptist tradition, all of us have the opportunity to go off the rails based on the tertiary, the third tier level issues that we can make first tier and first level issues, and that's how we get denominations to begin with. And that's why it's been important to me I would say in this season of my life, which I'm soon to be 55 as we're recording this video, that I have leaned more heavily into other traditions. Presbyterianism, Pentecostalism, Charismatic, Methodism, but then also, as I mentioned, reading the scripture with the early church fathers. There's been such a resurgence over the last couple of decades of us looking to the Puritans. Everyone, in Jonathan Edwards or John Calvin, and then to Martin Luther. There's this multi-century portion of history that we almost believe that if it's before Luther, like nothing happened between the Apostle Paul and Luther. And now I'm beginning to see, like you are, that there are many people, there's been this resurgence of wanting to understand, well, what was happening in the early church fathers, what was going on that caused the Council of Nicaea to come together. And again, because these are people that are leading the church, let's dispense with the fanciful kind of idea of who they were. These were just, followers of Christ, men and women who are trying to be faithful to the scripture, faithful to the gospel, to spread the gospel throughout the known world. But they're dealing with pagan cultures. Same as we're doing today. And so I love reaching back to find out how were they interacting with the scriptures, how are they interpreting the scriptures, not just what did they say, but the process by which they went about, so that then they would know how to live and how to live out the faith and spread the faith.
And I've read some John Chrysostom. I'm not sure if that's how you say his
Chrysostom.
last. Chrysostom. And he talks about entertainment. He talks about the technology of that day and how to implement that. I mean, this stuff is useful information. So we can't dismiss the church fathers. I've even gone into the Catholic Catechism and found some value into that. Now, there are obviously things I'm going to disagree with. Purgatory, the way they treat Mary and certain things, but I have gained some really rich benefit from their Trinitarian study. And I think the Catholic Church does that best, if I'm being honest. They have preserved the Trinity better than any movement. But yeah, as Protestants, we tend to think church history started in the 1500s. And we forget that there was nearly 1,300 years of major church history, 1,400 years even, of major church history that happened in between all that. And yes, things got off the rails, but we could say that about our own movements as well.
Yeah, and so when I get asked about what are books that have impacted my reading of Scripture and my understanding of Scripture, it does change from season to season, because 20 years ago, I would have probably talked about the works of Jonathan Edwards and others that are of his era. Then 10 years ago, I might have said something different. And so it is critical that we be willing to just consistently keep the Scripture as the center pole of everything in our lives, and then listen to the witness of the church. And as we know, you and I are going to disagree on certain issues, and we're friends. But that we're going to keep the peace and the unity among the people of God and learn where you can.
It's like if you have a target, the Scripture is going to be the bullseye. And then I think church history really needs to be outside that bullseye, because we're close to that point, especially the sons of the apostles like your Ignatius, Polycarp, and beyond. And then if you continue going, then you can move into like the Reformation, you can move into modern day preachers, to where all of these really represent the wholeness of church history and interpretation of the Scripture. And there is an orthodoxy that has been passed down that has remained unchanged. And I think that's kind of the safe spot. Is what have we agreed on for this 2,000 years of church history? And the rest of the stuff, I pick your denomination.
That's right. And then we wrestle on the secondary and third tier issues.
All right. Well, God bless you all.